She married a nobody. A broke, stubborn nobody who refuses to accept that she is dragging this family down. That was my mother-in-law speaking loudly enough for me to hear from the hallway outside the living room. I had just driven 40 minutes to drop off my daughter Maisie's birthday gift for her party, the party my husband's entire family had organized for our daughter, without once asking if I could come. Maisie was turning 7. I stood there in that hallway for a moment, holding a wrapped box with a purple bow, listening to my mother-in-law's voice float through the house like it owned every room. Because it did. Because it always had. I set the gift on the entryway table. I got back in my car, and I drove home with my hands so tight on the wheel that my knuckles went pale. That night, I sat on the floor of my kitchen at 11 o'clock and made a decision. Not a loud one. Not a dramatic one. I just decided I was done letting people who had never believed in me determine what my life looked like. Let me back up. I met my ex-husband in college. His family was old money, not the kind that shows up in headlines, but the kind that shows up in country clubs and endowments and quiet phone calls that open doors. My family was not that. My father drove a delivery truck. My mother cleaned offices 3 nights a week while finishing her nursing degree. I grew up understanding that nothing was given to you, and everything had to be earned twice because you also had to prove you deserved it. His mother, from the first holiday dinner, made her position clear. She would be polite. She would be civil. But she would never let me forget that I had come from somewhere lesser, and that her son had chosen down. My ex was not a bad man. He was a weak one, which is sometimes worse. He loved his mother more than he was capable of confronting her. Every time she made a comment about my clothes, my background, my job, the way I cooked, he would find a reason to be somewhere else in the house. He would come back and say she doesn't mean it like that, and I would smile and say, I know, and we would both pretend that was a real answer. I was a project coordinator for a mid-sized architecture firm. I was good at it. I worked my way from assistant to lead coordinator in 4 years, managing budgets and timelines and contractors on projects that routinely ran into the millions. I was methodical. I was precise. I did not miss things. My mother-in-law thought I worked in construction. She introduced me that way at parties. This is our daughter-in-law, she works in construction. Said with a smile that meant something else entirely. My ex said she didn't mean it like that. When Maisie was born, everything got quieter for a while. Babies have that effect. They force a kind of truce because everyone is looking at the same thing and agreeing it is wonderful. Maisie was wonderful. She had my stubbornness and her father's laugh, and from the first week of her life she would stare at ceiling fans with an intensity that made me think she was solving something. But the truce didn't hold. By Maisie's second birthday, the comments had shifted from being about me to being about what Maisie was getting, or not getting, from my side of things. My mother-in-law began making references to stability, to legacy, to what kind of environment a child needs to thrive. She started using the word advantages a lot, and she always said it while looking at me. The marriage didn't survive Maisie's 4th year. I won't detail the whole of it here. What I will say is that leaving was not the hard part. The hard part was what came after. The way his family closed ranks. The way my ex suddenly found the courage to take positions he'd never had before. The way a divorce attorney explained to me, very calmly, that I should prepare for a fight. I prepared for a fight. I also did something else. Over the 2 years I'd spent watching the dynamics of my marriage, I had gone back to school part-time, a master's program in construction management. I'd been afraid to tell my ex. He would have been supportive in theory, the way he was supportive of most things in theory, but his mother would have had opinions, and his opinions had a way of reshaping themselves around hers over time. So I kept it quiet. I studied after Maisie went to bed. I kept my textbooks in my office at work. I graduated 11 months before I filed for divorce. I also started my own consulting practice. Small at first. A few referrals from colleagues. A couple of small commercial builds where the general contractor needed someone to manage scope and budget. Nothing flashy, but real and growing. Nobody in his family knew. The divorce proceedings were where I first learned that my mother-in-law was more involved in my ex's finances than I had understood. She had been quietly funding certain things. The family home we lived in, mortgaged in a way I hadn't been aware of, with her as a silent co-signer. My ex's car. A personal loan that had never been documented. It was all designed to look like he had more than he did. And when the forensic accounting came back, the picture was different from the one we'd been living inside. My attorney was thorough. I had chosen her specifically because 3 people I respected had described her using the same word, relentless. The custody hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in November. 2 days before, my mother-in-law called me. I hadn't spoken to her since I'd moved out. She had my number, though. She had always had my number. "I want you to know," she said, and her voice was the same smooth, measured voice she used at dinner parties, "that this family will not allow Maisie to be raised in instability. If you push this, you will regret it. You don't have the resources for a prolonged battle. I suggest you be practical." I listened to the whole thing. I didn't say much. When she finished, I said, "Thank you for calling," and I hung up. Then I went to my laptop and sent my attorney a message with 3 attachments. 2 were documents I had collected over the last year, financial records, communications, a specific email chain that was going to be very uncomfortable for a specific person to explain in front of a judge. The third was a signed contract for a commercial development project, newly executed, with my consulting firm as lead project manager. The contract value had 6 figures before the decimal point. My attorney responded in 12 minutes. All she wrote was, "Perfect timing." The morning of the hearing, I wore a dark blazer I'd bought the week before. Not expensive looking, just clean and fitted and serious. Maisie had slept at my sister's place the night before. I had slept not at all. We sat in the courtroom, my ex's family arranged on one side like they were at a formal dinner, my mother-in-law in the second row in a cream-colored coat, spine straight, the picture of composed confidence. My ex sat at the table with his attorney. He didn't look at me for the first 40 minutes. His attorney made their opening case, instability, uncertain income, a new and unproven business, the suggestion that a child needs consistency, and that consistency was more available on one side of this courtroom than the other. My attorney let them finish. Then she stood up and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to submit several documents into evidence." And she handed them to the clerk, and I watched my mother-in-law's face from across the room. The financial record showed that my ex's stable situation depended almost entirely on funds from his mother, funds that were undisclosed, inconsistently structured, and in at least one instance had been used to create a false impression of independent financial stability for the purposes of this proceeding. That last part was the email chain. The consulting contract showed my income, not projected, actual, signed, effective as of 6 weeks ago. My ex's attorney asked for a recess. The judge, a woman in her 60s who had clearly heard every possible version of every possible story, looked at the submitted documents for a moment, then looked up and said, in a tone that had no patience and no performance in it, "Counselor, does your client understand that misrepresenting financial standing to this court is not a civil matter?" The room was very quiet. His attorney said something carefully worded. The judge looked at it the way you look at something you've already decided about. The recess was granted. In the hallway, my mother-in-law walked toward me, and I thought, for one moment, that she was going to say something that mattered, something real, some acknowledgement. She said, "You're making a mistake." I looked at her. This woman who had called me a nobody in her own hallway, who had introduced me as someone who worked in construction like it was an apology, who had called me 2 days ago to warn me off with the confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone who could make it stick. I said, "I don't think so." And I went back into the courtroom. The final custody arrangement gave me primary placement. My ex has generous visitation every other weekend, alternating holidays, 2 weeks in summer. I wasn't trying to keep Maisie from her father. I was trying to keep her father's family from making decisions about her life the same way they tried to make decisions about mine. Maisie doesn't know the details of what happened in that courtroom. She knows that her mom and dad live in different houses and that she is loved by both of them. She knows that when something is hard, you figure it out instead of waiting for someone to figure it out for you. I have been very deliberate about what I teach her and in what order. She turned 7 3 months after the hearing. I rented out a room at a local children's art studio. The kind with big tables and paint in every color, and an instructor who is patient and funny and makes every kid feel like a real artist. I invited 10 of Maisie's friends. I ordered a cake shaped like a butterfly, which is what she asked for, because she had been obsessed with butterflies since August for reasons she has not fully explained. My ex attended part of the party. We were civil. We are always civil now, because Maisie is watching and she is smarter than either of us gives her credit for. My mother-in-law was not there. She had sent a gift through my ex, a very expensive toy that I recognized as the kind of gift designed to impress an adult, not to delight a 7-year-old. Maisie opened it, said, "Oh," and put it aside in favor of the art supplies her school friend had brought. I watched Maisie sit at one of those big tables, her face concentrated and paint on her left elbow, and I thought about all the dinners where someone had looked at me like I didn't belong at the table. And then I thought about how that feeling, which I had carried around for years like it was just part of the weight of things, was mostly gone now. Not all the way gone. It comes back sometimes, in small ways. Someone makes an assumption, or I catch myself shrinking before I even know why, and I have to remind myself of what I know to be true now. But mostly gone. My consulting practice has grown. I took on a second major client last spring, a hospitality group developing 3 properties in the region. It requires more travel than I'd like, but I've figured out the logistics and Maisie has become very good at video calls. She gives me tours of whatever she's building with her Legos. The tours are detailed and she explains her structural choices. I don't know where she gets that. About 2 months after the birthday party, my mother-in-law called again. Different tone this time. Quieter. She said she'd like to talk. She said things hadn't gone the way she intended. She said she hoped we could find a way to be. She paused here, searching for the word cordial for Maisie's sake. I was in my car in a parking garage, between meetings, eating half a sandwich. I said, "I appreciate that. We'll see how things go." She waited, I think, for something more. Some door opening. Some warmth returning. I said I had to get back to work, and I did. That's the thing nobody tells you about getting to the other side of something hard. It doesn't always come with a dramatic moment of closure. Sometimes the other person just calls and uses a quieter voice and you eat your sandwich and go back to your meeting. Sometimes the win is quiet. Sometimes it looks like a 7-year-old with paint on her elbow who is too absorbed in her butterfly cake to pay attention to anything her grandmother sent. I am 32 years old. I own my consulting practice. I have primary custody of the most interesting person I have ever met. I sleep through the night now, which sounds small and is not small at all. My mother-in-law still refers to me, I'm told, as the ex-wife. Which is fine. I don't need to be anything in her vocabulary that requires more syllables than that. I know who I am. And that's the whole story. I used to think that fairness was something other people decided for you, that if you were quiet enough, patient enough, good enough at your job, eventually someone in the room would look up and say, "Okay, we see you, we were wrong about you. Welcome." That's not how it works. I know that now. What I learned, not from a book, not from anyone who sat me down and explained it, is that the way you live accumulates. Every choice you make is a brick, and you are building something whether you intend to or not. My mother-in-law spent years building a version of the world where she held the measuring stick and everyone else was measured. She built it carefully. She reinforced it constantly, and for a long time it held. But she was building on the assumption that I would stay still, that I would keep absorbing the weight of her opinions and her introductions and her quiet cruelties, without redirecting any of that energy into something she couldn't account for. She never considered what I was building on the other side of the wall. I think about the night I decided to go back to school. Maisie was maybe 18 months old and I was exhausted in the way that only that specific season of life can exhaust you. Deep in the bones, no end in sight. And I sat there after she fell asleep and I thought, what do I actually want to be able to say I did? Not to impress anyone. Not to prove anything to the woman who introduced me as someone who worked in construction. Just, what do I want? What is true about me that no one in that house has bothered to find out? That question changed the whole shape of things. There's something that happens when you stop spending your energy managing other people's perceptions of you. All that effort you were using to stay small, to not cause trouble, to absorb insults gracefully. It becomes available for something else. I put it into the degree, then into the practice, then into 3 documents that I handed to my attorney the day before a custody hearing, and everything shifted. My mother-in-law called me a nobody. She said it in her own hallway loud enough for me to hear because she had never had any reason to be careful around me. That is the thing about underestimating someone for years. You stop guarding yourself against them. You get sloppy. You say things in hallways. And Maisie. I think about Maisie sitting at that art table with paint on her elbow, completely absorbed, not thinking about any of it. She didn't know what had happened in a courtroom 2 months before. She didn't know that someone had tried to use her as leverage, or that leverage had been turned around. She just knew her mom was there and the cake was shaped like a butterfly, and her friend had brought good art supplies. That is the whole point. That is what all of it was for. I don't have any dramatic lesson to wrap around what happened to me. What I have is this: I did the work when no one was watching. I documented what needed to be documented. I stayed quiet when staying quiet was the right move, and I spoke when I had something worth saying. And when the moment came, I was ready for it. Not because I got lucky, but because I had been getting ready for years without calling it that. Maisie is going to face rooms where someone looks at her and decides, before she opens her mouth, what she is worth. I cannot protect her from those rooms. What I can do is make sure she grows up watching what it looks like to walk into them anyway, to do the work anyway, to build quietly and steadily until the thing you've built speaks for itself. That's what I'm trying to give her. Not the story of how I won. The habit of not waiting for permission to begin.